for. My name is Tabitha Acton, and I'm one of the farming advisors in the Farming and Land Use team here at the Soil Association, and have done a lot of the kind of delivery on the Future Farm Resilience. And thankfully for everybody, I'm joined by some experts this evening in terms of the natural capital and green finance. So on the screen, you can see Johanna Norris, who's our specialist within the team for natural capital. And she's based up in Scotland. We've got Ed Seymour from the Woodland Trust to talk to us about the Woodland Code. And we've got Tony Martin from E3 Ecology, who's an ecologist up here in Northumberland as well, to talk to us about Biodiversity Net Gain. We also have a recorded presentation from the Peatland team to talk about the Peatland Code as well. So that'll be coming up in the middle. So I will share my screen now. Any questions, please pop them in the chat or wait until the end and we'll kind of do a bit of a panel session after the presentation. So we've just got 3 fairly short presentations to give you the background and the key points, and then lots and lots of questions are welcome. So you can either prep them in the chat or say them yourself at the end if you would rather. Anything else, please stick your hand up or again put it in the chat and we'll keep an eye on everything. So I will get the slides up. And like I say, if it's not appearing for you, so I've just put them up there now, they should start to appear on your screens. If they're not, do try just logging off and logging back in again, and that seems to work. So to start with, I'm going to give a little bit of an update on just where we are now. Unfortunately, it's not as much information as I would like to be able to give. We are going to do another proper update in December, as we're expecting to have lots of details by then. We think it's basically going to be the budget will come out and then they will give us some details after that. So I'll just give a quick run through that. Then Johanna's going to talk us through what is natural capital. Ed's going to do the Woodland Carbon Code. We've got that video from the Peatland for the Peatland Code, then Biodiversity Net Gain, and then we'll go into questions. So stewardship and SFI. So obviously there's lots of stuff going on now. There's a few people that are still in old HLS. But in terms of what we kind of expected the picture to be by this point was that you have SFI down at the bottom there, which is slightly lower complexity, very easy to apply for if you're in nothing at all, more complicated if you're in other stuff. And kind of gives you a decent amount of money depending on what you're going for, more so if you're in arable or lowland, less so if you're upland. Then we had like original countryside stewardship that some people will still be in as well. A lot of people took rollovers or had longer term agreements. And then there's higher tier stewardship as well. What it's kind of ended up as is that the SFI expanded offer has now taken over what was going to be SFI and what was the mid-tier countryside stewardship, and then they're still referring to what was higher tier as higher tier. So for a bit, we're going to end up with people with higher tier in HLS, higher tier in countryside stewardship, and the new higher tier, which is as complicated as it sounds, but we're still waiting for the detail on that. But the 2024 expanded offer, which we got details for in the summer, is kind of covering what was mid-tier as well. In terms of applying for that, this was how you applied, and like I said, quite simple for SFI if you're not in anything else, but it does recognise on the system where things overlap. But at the moment, they are still just taking applications for this through expressions of interest. So if you go on the website, if you click saying that you want to give an expression of interest, this is the first page that comes up. They say it only takes 5 to 10 minutes. And you need to give them an outline of what you're wanting to apply for, but you're not going to get held to this, so don't panic about it. But they do kind of, they're going to base how quickly they ask you to apply on what you put in that information. So if you say it's going to be very simple and actually it's not. You just won't get an agreement very quickly. But the simple applications are getting turned around very quickly. So you're getting invited to apply. Kind of some people are getting it next day. The ones that are more complicated being slower to hear back. And that's basically that everybody giving them the system time for applications to go through, because DEFRA is still having to check things physically a lot, which is obviously something that they're hoping to get away from, but they haven't got away from at this point. The couple of key points on this, completing it doesn't affect your previous agreements, but they will check against current applications and stuff to see what will work. And yes, sorry, the second point is that it doesn't affect your agreements, but they will check it against what you're currently in. So if you're suggesting that you're going to do all sorts of things that don't match up with what you're currently in, they will flag that. So just be sensible about what you pop in. There's lots of things available. This is all on the DEFRA website, and I'll put a link to it in the follow-up email. But some of the newer stuff, so there's some boundary options which includes stone walls, which the previous stuff didn't. So if you've got any walling, that's a very easy one. You get a payment per 100 meters, but you literally just have to take a picture when a bit of wall goes down and when you put it back up again, and that has to be within 12 months of it going down. So very easy to get your money for that one. The small buffer strips things, there's a few more upland and moorland ones. Those are a lot of supplementary ones that you have to be on the base, and then you can do the supplement. There's some more soil health options, which are linked to kind of precision farming and things. And there's a few more water bodies ones and stuff. So if there's anything particularly you're interested in there, worth going to have a look. One of those options within the grassland stuff is an endorsed option. So your natural income advisor has to say that you can be in that option. But the other ones are all kind of open to apply for without any support. Obviously there is support if you want it, but you can just crack on and apply for those without having to have anybody out. The areas that we're still waiting for, this is being pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, as many of you will know. So this is the higher tier stuff, and any other options, which basically will all be options that need to be endorsed, and it'll be a bit more of a working with your natural income advisor application. The last meeting I attended that had Janet Hughes on said that it was going to be soon. She also followed that up with before the end of the year, and this was last month. So obviously they feel like slightly different timelines, but we are expecting it before Christmas. The last thing on countryside stewardship is that capital grants are still open, and they're no longer linked to being within a countryside stewardship agreement. So anybody can get a capital grants for any of this work. So if you have got stuff that you want to do, fencing, etc., then have a little look, because you can still, it often doesn't cover the whole price of the job, but it does make it considerably easier. So if there is stuff that you're intending on doing, do have a look at a capital grant. And yeah, the date for the higher tier is to be confirmed. So I will hand over to Johanna for the next part of the evening. And yeah, like I said, questions in the chat, or wait until the end and we can go through them then.
Thanks, Tabitha. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Yes, we can.
Great. So we'll be hearing later a little bit about different schemes which distribute finances in relation to natural capital, but we thought we'd wind it back a little bit and take a few minutes just to go into detail about what natural capital actually means. So normally when people talk about capital, we just heard about a capital grant there, we're talking about financial or produced capital. And if we take the dictionary definition from Collins, capital is also referred to as a large sum of money which you use to start a business or which you invest in order to make more money. This might sound very familiar to a lot of you. So whereas there's no money out in nature, there is this thing called natural capital, and it's basically a tool which is used, or a term which is used to try and understand the value behind a lot of our businesses. So natural capital, in one definition, is the world's habitats and ecosystems which form the basis of people's livelihoods. For example, the rocks used to build their houses with, to the food that they eat. So it's basically a method which has been around since the 70s, but in recent years, particularly in the last decade or so, it's come into the foreground a bit more because it's seen as a way that we can, a framework to measure the state of nature. So you might be rich in financial capital terms. You might be a company, investment bank, which has a lot of money, financial wealth, but you don't own any land. So you're poor in natural capital assets. Farmers, on the other hand, who own their land, are very rich in natural capital assets. But that, again, comes down to the way that the land is managed. So land which is managed where the soil health is high, and there are many other assets on the land, from woodland and waterways, that will be a place with much higher natural capital value than a site where the land isn't being managed so well. Just as another example, a drained peatland has a lower natural capital value than an intact bog. That's because a drained peatland releases a lot of carbon. We all know the value of carbon, in particular in reaching our net zero targets. So an intact bog, in relation to that, with the other benefits it provides, like flood protection, has a much higher natural capital value. And how exactly do we measure natural capital? I've just broken this down into 4 segments based on a diagram from the Land Use Change company. So we start with measuring what stocks and flows are on the land. So that's everything from the trees, the soil, the animals on the land, from the livestock to the wild species there as well, and even things like wind, or the air quality. Those are all natural capital assets, and they might all be in different degrees of quality. And then we have the ecosystem services that come from these natural capital assets. So from the livestock, there will be meat production. From the arable land, you'll get crops. Water is a super important natural capital ecosystem service. The quality, depending on how the land is managed. Secondly, we've got regulating services, so that will be things like carbon storage and the way that water is recycled in the system. And then thirdly, we have cultural ecosystem services, and that kind of already goes in towards the cultural capital side of things rather than natural capital, but they are often bound up in natural capital. So things like tourism and mental well-being, these are all services that healthy natural capital ecosystems provide. And then lastly, kind of overarching all of these 3 different types of ecosystem service is the supporting services. So here we've got a picture of photosynthesis. All life on Earth depends on this in some form or another. Nutrient recycling, and the function of the soil, as well as the abilities for pollination to take place. These are other supporting services. And each of these services is bound up with benefits. I've already mentioned a few of them: food, warmth to fuel our and energy to fuel our homes, healthy lifestyles, protection from flooding, and just generally sustainable lives for all living things into the future. And of course, each of these benefits has a value, whether that be creating jobs, creating income, which ultimately leads to growth of GDP, but in the end, maintaining natural capital assets leads to a healthy population.
Thank you, Johanna. That was that your last
I think I've
slide?
got one more slide.
Oh, you have, of
Yeah.
course, sorry.
Yeah, so Tabitha touched upon the sustainable farming incentive before. So there's, broadly speaking, two ways that we can fund natural capital and the value of nature. And some other examples from public finance are in Scotland. There's the agri-environment climate schemes. We're going to hear later about the Biodiversity Net Gain approach. In Wales, it would be the Habitat scheme, and in Northern Ireland, environment farming schemes. There are some drawbacks associated with the public financing of natural capital. Things tend to be quite centralised and slow to react. But the advantage is that there's the integrity of being government backed. Whereas private finance, there seems to be a lot more scope and variability. We're going to hear later about carbon credits. Carbon credits are the currency that's used to pay for enhancing natural capital related to woodland creation or improving peatland restoration. But there are also lots of different types of private finance that go beyond just credits. So we've listed some here. Crowdfunding, that's a form of private finance from the local community, for example. Any sort of finance within the supply chain, even things like the organic premium, that's a form of private finance to improve sustainable land management. Bank loans, that's becoming increasingly talked about, differing the interest rate based on a farm's resilience. And I guess some of the common drawbacks associated with private finance of natural capital projects is the fear of greenwashing. There is also still a significant gap which the public sector needs the private sector to fill. And there are often quite high demands in the data requested by companies that provide private financing for nature. But at the same time, they are more flexible than typically than the public schemes, and there's also a bit more scope to adapt. So a lot of the private finance schemes are longer lived than in the public sector.
Great, thank you. We will go straight on to Ed about the Woodland Carbon Code, and then we'll start doing those questions when we get to the end of the speakers. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tabitha. My name's Ed Seymour. I'm a land agent, and for the last 3 years I've been working for the Woodland Trust, predominantly with the work that we do under the Woodland Carbon Code, supporting third-party farmers and landowners to access carbon finance. The Woodland Trust has been involved on its own estate since about 2014, and for the last 3 years we've been providing those services. I've got a 15-minute slot to talk to you about the Woodland Carbon Code. That's a bit of a challenge. There's quite a lot to cover. So what I'm going to try to do is give a brief overview of what it is, how it works, and then I've given a number of top tips. And I'm very happy for my contact details to go out with the slides as well. So if people do want to follow up, please do get in touch. Can I control the slides? Yes, I can. That's good. Right. What is the Woodland Carbon Code? So the Woodland Carbon Code.
Sorry, you can control them for yourself, but not for everybody else, then. So I'm afraid you will have to just next slide it. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so you should be on a what is the Woodland Carbon Code slide now.
Yeah.
So the Woodland Carbon Code is a DEFRA-backed methodology for quantifying carbon sequestration from woodland creation projects. So it is administered by Scottish Forestry on behalf of DEFRA, but it is fundamentally a government endorsed standard for generating and then continuing to monitor a voluntary carbon offset. A voluntary carbon offset is a form of unit that allows UK businesses to offset their unavoidable carbon emissions and link that to a tangible project that gives comfort and integrity by the fact that it's independently verified. So in a nutshell, that's how it works. For you as farmers, it means a project of up to 100 years, and it runs in parallel with statutory grant schemes and other funding mechanisms. I'll come on to explain there is a bit of, you do have to consider one or the other at times, but generally speaking, this is something you do in addition to going down the UCO path, for example, with statutory funding. Next slide, please. Oh, I don't think it changes it for me, so I'm going to just assume you've moved on to the next slide. So how does it work? There is what we refer to as what tend to refer to as the carbon cycle. So in terms of what this looks like in practice, you would follow the standard woodland creation process under a statutory grant claim, which you may be familiar with. This will run alongside that. So when you get to a point where you've had your grant offer and you are ready to plant, you will register the scheme under the Woodland Carbon Code. That involves doing an initial calculation and submitting a plan, which your project developer can do for you, or you can do yourself. You then have a 3-year window to undertake planting and move to the next stage, which is submitting the paperwork for validation. Validation of the scheme is the point that you are first audited externally by a third party, usually the Soil Association, and that will review eligibility for this scheme, how you're intending to manage it, and that you are meeting Woodland Carbon Code requirements. Once you've gone through that process, you have a validated scheme within 3 years of registration. Units are issued. So there are 2 forms of units that are generally referred to with the Woodland Carbon Code. The first is a pending issuance unit. That is what is issued on validation, and that will represent, or the number of units will represent, the carbon to be sequestered over the lifetime of the scheme. So if you have a woodland creation scheme that will run for 100 years and sequester 1,000 tonnes of carbon, you will receive 1,000 PRUs on validation. That allows for trading and for carbon finance to cover costs and that sort of thing. What you are then committed to, whether or not you sell units, is an ongoing verification process. So this is towards the end of this arrow, which is from year 5 of a scheme and every 10 years thereafter, monitoring the trees, ensuring that they are growing at the yield classes that you've assumed they will. And what will happen at each of those verification events, which is audited again by Soil Association, is a proportion of those PRUs will convert to what are called woodland carbon units. Those represent actual carbon locked up in the trees, and it's those units that businesses can make claims about having offset emission through the purchase of woodland carbon units. So initially you will have 100% of units as PRUs, but then in 10-yearly intervals, referred to as vintages, a proportion will convert. I've just seen a note about pricing. I'll come on to that in a second. Next slide, please. So a few bits about rules, eligibility criteria. One of the key pieces of things to take away from this is that you have to register prior to works commencing. That's not just trees going in the ground, that's fencing or groundworks. You need to register the scheme prior to that happening to show that basically carbon finance was part of the conversation. It's not just been added in at the last minute. It was done before any work started because it was part of the plan for the project. It's for new woodland creation, so you need to be able to demonstrate that the land has not previously been under woodland cover in the last 25 years, which is usually relatively straightforward from historic OS maps and satellite information. You cannot develop on organic soil, so 30 centimetres of peat in England, 50 centimetres of peat in Scotland. There's a minimum density, so 400 stems per hectare for any planting and natural colonisation. And a minimum project size of 1 hectare. There used to not be a minimum. 1 hectare has now been introduced. And there are also legal and financial additionality tests. I'm not going to go into those in massive detail because that could be a presentation in itself, but basically you have to, with your project developer's help, demonstrate that the project required carbon finance to make it financially viable or competitive. Next slide. In terms of what you're committing to, so this is Woodland Carbon Code specific, but some of these might apply whether you've got a Forestry Commission approved woodland management plan or you're applying for a felling license. So you may be committed to some of these anyway if you're going down the woodland creation or management route. So commitment to a permanent land use change to woodland. Woodland Carbon Code projects are expected to be UKFS compliant, but as are UCO woodlands, and so that shouldn't be too onerous. You have to comply with the Woodland Carbon Code standard. I've given a summary of the key commitments, but there are others. Maintain and update a management plan for the woodland as it establishes. Restock where projects involve harvesting. Again, you would expect that to be the case anyway. Replant in the event of loss due to any reason, wind, fire, pests, and notify the Woodland Carbon Code if there is a loss of carbon. Next slide, please. So what does this look like in practice? I've taken one of our schemes. So this is a project of ours in Derbyshire. You can see the site on the left in the plan. You've got the red line boundary, the yellow line is the deer fence, and the green is the planting areas with various bits of open space. We will complete a Woodland Carbon Code calculation, which is this table at the top right, the yellow table. You can see there at the bottom right-hand corner, 5,448 units. That's the number of PIUs that will be generated on validation. And each of these lines is basically a verification event. So at year 5, 13 units will convert to WCUs. Year 15, verification, 1,108, and so on until you get to the end of the 100 years and the full number of units have been verified. The table below it is basically, it's this table as a graph. As you can see, sequestration rates for this particular project drop off quite significantly after 50 years. So I do think there is a question, depending on what your project looks like, how long you commit for, because is it worth the extra 50 years of commitment for a few hundred more units? That will be for you to decide, but it's worth bearing in mind because it is a long-term commitment and there are obligations that come with it. Next slide, please. So this is a point on pricing. The Woodland Carbon Code, Woodland Carbon Code market in the UK is relatively new, and there is not a huge amount of transparency over pricing. That said, the Woodland Carbon Code does try to monitor pricing. There is an average pricing point was published in a piece of research in the region of £25 per unit. So if you take a carbon yield of 250 to 500 tonnes per hectare, that's quite wide, but every project is different, whether it's a native scheme or a non-native conifer scheme. That gives you an idea of the gross value that these units might achieve as PIUs. But the table below, I think, is interesting. It looks at the number of units sold over the last 3 years, although the 2023 figures are not the complete year, which skews it slightly. I think what's particularly interesting here is, although there might be an average price point of £25 per unit, the difference between the highest and the lowest price, so the spread or range of prices is very significant, nearly £38, which suggests that some units are being traded well above the average of £25 per unit and likewise below. I'll come on to why that is in a little bit on the next slide. The value in nominal terms is actual cash, and then the real terms is just adjusted for inflation. So that's the reason for the two separate lines there. In terms of where I wanted to finish, I should probably, if we go on to the next slide, but I'll talk through the pricing data that we have is essentially for PIUs. There's a question in the chat about the price for WCUs. There is not a reliable and significant source of data on what WCUs are worth, because, to be quite honest, the Woodland Carbon Code started in 2011, I think, and if you look at the peak rates where projects will deliver peak conversion to woodland carbon units, it's generally from year 15 to 35. So even the earliest projects haven't necessarily verified a significant number of WCUs. So there will have been sales, but a lot of those will have been sold as PIUs prior to converting, rather than being sold as WCUs. And where sales have happened, there's no real transparency, and it's likely to be in very small numbers. So it's a challenge, and I appreciate it's an uncertainty, but at the moment there's certainly not the research or the data there to back up those prices consistently. I wanted to finish on sort of 5 tips really for if you're thinking about developing a scheme in practice. So I've started with not all units are created equal, and this goes back to that point about, for all that I've given you average prices and what that might mean per hectare, ultimately this relies on finding a buyer, and the buyer will almost certainly want to use those units for a set net zero date potentially, and therefore units that mature into WCUs by fixed dates, and particularly 2050, you would expect to have a greater value or greater demand, because there are businesses that have set targets of reaching net zero by those dates. It's not that other units won't have a value, but I think that's why you're seeing that big range on the previous slide of around £38, because the units will convert at different times, and some will be more in demand than others. Look at long-term cash flow. This is a 100-year commitment, and there are quite substantial fixed costs of developing schemes. I mentioned the ongoing verification. There is a cost associated with having soil association, soil association verify your schemes, and it's really important that you don't just look at any upfront payments for carbon. You are working out how this project is going to be developed, and looking at the cash flow for the full length of the project, and your project developer should be able to help you with that if you ask them the question. This rolls into the next one, which is to look beyond the headline unit price. Everyone wants to know what a carbon unit is trading at for the Woodland Carbon Code, but it depends. You might have someone come and offer you, particularly a project developer, if they're buying and trading units themselves, they might offer you a unit price. But if you're paying brokerage off that, if you are then paying project developer services, soil association fees, very quickly you will erode a headline unit price. And it's really important that when you're talking to project developers, you're clear on those, and you try and drill down to what is the net unit price that you will receive, because that allows you to compare between different offers, getting to that sort of level of insight. Fourth point is be realistic about timescale. I mentioned registration, planting, validation. You can deliver PIUs a number of years after planting, and so this can be, if you allow for how long it takes to get a statutory grant scheme in place and actually get trees going into the ground, this can be something that is delivered a number of years from when you first start planning the woodland. And the final point really is scrutiny of calculations, and making sure that calculations are reflective of how you want to manage the woodland, because PIUs are an estimate. They need to be delivered, and therefore the calculations need to reflect how you're going to manage the woodland and what you want to do with the woodland. It's relatively easy to get that wrong or be over ambitious, and through assumptions that might seem like they are reducing or inflating a carbon yield, you get yourself into a position later down the line where actually that's not how the woodland will be managed, and carbon isn't delivered, and therefore you're potentially looking at a loss of units later down the line, which, if you sold those units, could be a really difficult position to be in. So I hope that was helpful. I saw lots of questions coming in, which I think we'll leave to the panel, but I'm happy to pick up then.
Yeah, there's a couple, Ed, that we'll do now that are very specific, and then there's some of them. So if I don't get your question answered now, I do intend on bringing it back up later, so don't panic. One of them was actually really relevant to that last point from Bill. Assuming verification is done on the basis of volume increase, does this take account of variation in density according to different species?
Yes, but don't underestimate how blunt the Woodland Carbon Code calculator tool is. Basically, once you are planting at above 1,100 stems per hectare, the density doesn't the kind of what it equates to in number of units it drops off massively. There's various reasons for that, but at higher densities you would expect greater thinning, and therefore you arrive at a similar figure to a density of around 1,100 stems per hectare. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect tool at all, and it's a lot easier to explain if you have a project So I can follow up separately if you have a project, but the principle is 1100 stems per hectare and up is likely to reach the kind of maximum sequestration rates, but you're not going to get a massive jump up by increasing stocking levels from 1100 to 1600 stems or 2000 or more.
Great, thank you. One of the other ones that was quite specific was, does the Woodland Carbon Code allow exotic trees as non-local trees?
This is key, and I should add that my experience and my comments, and particularly that last comment, is based on my experience working for the Woodland Trust. So we are developing native broadleaf schemes. So I would have to check the point of stocking density with a more commercial non-native mix. Yes, it's not just native broadleafs. Non-native conifer species and various other species can be included. There are limits to what can be included. There are some species that I'm aware of that aren't, and some that you have to put in. Well, that you can put in, but they don't count towards carbon because they're secondary species and sort of not they're basically slightly bigger than shrub species. So there's a pretty broad range, and it does include non-native.
Great. And the last one that we'll do before we move on is which one was it? Oh God, I've lost it now. How would the Woodland Carbon Code work with natural colonisation?
Yeah, so natural colonisation can be included as well as planting. There are a range of different rules that apply in terms of you can't always claim units up front as PIUs. It relates to where the nearest seed source is, but it limits your yield class assumptions. So generally, what the difference between planting and natural colonisation is, with natural colonisation, you may be generating units after validation at verification, or you'll be able to generate a proportionate validation, and there will be, if the site is performing really well at higher yield classes, you will get more units later down the line.
Great. We've also had a bit of clarification just on the density question. It was actually relating to hardwood versus softwood rather than.
I see. Okay. I might need to check that point, but basically, the way the Woodland Carbon Calculator works is you enter your species, you use the Forest Research ESC tool in most cases, which will give a site-specific and climate model specific yield class assumption. So typically that will be higher for commercial softwood trees, but the native hardwoods will still perform on the right site at a reasonable level. So yes, in that term, in those terms, it depends on your species selection. It depends on the site, but yeah, commercial softwood is likely to sequester more carbon than broadleaf. There are then there are then kind of layers to that, because you might be more likely to be thinning heavily, and that will affect the kind of carbon output. So as with everything, the devil is in the detail, but yeah, hopefully that gives a slightly better answer.
Great, thanks, Ed. Well, like I said, I'll save the other questions until the end for the panel. So we'll move on now to the Peatland Code presentation. So fingers crossed this will work. If anybody's struggling with this, let us know. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it. If you can't, again, like with the slides, try logging off and coming back on again. But we will send it round afterwards as well. So if you're really struggling, if you want to take a 10-minute break and come back, then it'll be on the email that comes around afterwards. But otherwise, hopefully this will work for you all. So I'm just pressing play now. Great. I hope that worked for everybody. Like Garrett said at the end there, her contact details were there. I'll close that so you can still see them for a little bit longer. I will share them in the follow-up email as well. And I'm happy to put any questions from the chat to her. But equally, if you just want to get in touch yourself, please do. We can ask them in all of the different ways and should make sure we can get some answers back. I'm just going to stop sharing it this way because we had classic technical issues before we started. And I'm just going to share the next PowerPoint in a slightly different manner so that we can make sure everybody can see everything, if I can find it. So that everything works. So hopefully you'll be able to see the presentation again. I'll just share it so it's properly. Hopefully it will show us a slideshow again. And hand over to Tony Martin from E3 Ecology to talk through these slides on biodiversity net gain.
Excellent, thanks Tabitha. Biodiversity net gain, it's the idea that developments should result in enhancements for biodiversity rather than losses as a result of development. And it's assessed using the biodiversity metric, but only applies to developments in England. So everything that I'm talking about applies to England, but not Scotland, Wales, Ireland. I think it's a concept which is likely to increase in the future. Basically, biodiversity net gain is measured using the biodiversity metric, which is a tool to measure habitats and habitat change, and is effectively an option that can be considered if you're a land manager or a farmer. The background to this is that habitats and species have been declining enormously over recent years, and there's lots of indicators that you could look at, but this is one for the abundance of priority species, which was published by the government and shows a very steep decline over the last 50 years. And you could look at lots of different ecological indices and find the same pattern. So next slide. So a simple test might be, as a result of this new development, and that might be an example of a development, will biodiversity be enhanced? And you could look at a development like this, and if this was on an area of grassland and scrub and woodland, most certainly it won't be enhanced. And the metric is a tool to measure those changes. Next slide. If you had a very large development site with comparatively small development area, and the green space included areas of wildflower grassland and ponds and hedgerows and scrub, and perhaps it was on a land that was formerly arable, then you could have a situation where a development does result in a net habitat gain. Next slide. The requirement for assessment has been delivered through the Environment Act, and that now requires that changes in biodiversity resulting from development have to be measured, and developments where the planning application was put in after February 2024 have to show that they deliver a 10% net gain. That gain is measured using the biodiversity metric, and as we saw in the previous examples, it's likely that many developments won't be able to deliver gain within the development red line boundary, and therefore we'll be looking to deliver it off-site. And the idea is that this creates a potential market in effectively habitat enhancement. Next. So what is the biodiversity metric? Basically, it's an Excel spreadsheet with lots of calculations hidden in the background. It only looks at habitats, so species are addressed in the planning process separately. And it requires, as a start point, habitat mapping and the condition of those habitats to be assessed. And this is a fairly complicated process which requires a good degree of ecological knowledge, and so would generally be done by specialist ecologists and consultants. And what you then have to do is measure the baseline habitats before the development, feed all of those into the spreadsheet, and then measure the proposed habitats after development. And that will include probably retention of some habitats, loss of some habitats, and creation of new ones. And basically the metric then gives you a change in biodiversity units, and also a percentage change in the site. And what you're looking for is a percentage change which gives you that 10% net gain. And if you can't deliver that on the site, then the metric needs to include off-site habitat creation or enhancement to then show that that delivers that 10% net gain. Next. So we now have a requirement in England that development, all significant developments, deliver enhanced biodiversity gains. And part of the government's idea is that the requirement to enhance or create habitats elsewhere could replace effectively government grants, such as elements of SFI, with private sector funding, and therefore get those benefits without the government having to pay for it. It results in a legal agreement being in place before those units can be sold, so the structures are in place to guarantee delivery, and units which are sold then recorded onto a national database. Next. Within the metric, there's a requirement for trading up. So the idea is that you can't lose a small area of high value habitat and replace it with a big area of a poorer quality habitat. So you've got to trade up to ones that are better quality than the habitats to be lost, and ideally the same habitat type or of a higher value habitat type. And what we would expect is that this will lead to a demand for enhancement of diverse grassland, scrub, individual trees, pools. One that's going to be a difficult one is brownfield habitats, because often brownfield habitats are lost to development, but they score quite highly, so they will need compensation or offsetting for it. And then there'll probably be a smaller demand for higher value habitats, and this would include watercourse enhancement, woodland, upland habitats, scarcer habitats. Next. There was a DEFRA consultation document a couple of years back, and that indicated that they were anticipating that a single biodiversity unit would result in, would have a price of perhaps £20,000 to £25,000. There's guidance which indicates that you can't stack biodiversity gains with other things such as farming grants. So if you're going for biodiversity net gain, you can't get other payments in parallel. But looking at that consultation and some of the figures behind it, the anticipation is that BNG should deliver a better income that would be obtained through government grants, because otherwise people would go probably for the grants rather than BNG. Next. So the overview would be that if you had an area of land which was currently fairly intensively managed and improved, but you fancied putting in some scrub and hedgerows and species-rich grassland and ponds, then biodiversity net gain may be a way in England of getting a financial income from those changes. Next. So looking at that in a bit of broad brush, the value of biodiversity units and the demand for them will be highest close to areas of development, so close to big cities, stuff where there's a lot of investment, and particularly areas where there's little green space. There's also developing proposal for local nature recovery strategies, and if your land is within such an area, then you get more benefit and more likely to have interest in those areas. And there are also national character area maps, which can be found on Magic, and ideally the offsetting should be in the same national character area or local planning authority area as the habitats which are being lost. The habitats which are being created have to be delivered for 30 years, so it's a long-term commitment. At present, you might be looking at perhaps £17,000 to £25,000 value per biodiversity unit, but there have been examples of units sold in the southeast for up to £90,000. But it's a very early market, and we don't know how things will change in the future. And the more competition is there for delivering units, then that's likely to drive down prices. If you've got habitats of high distinctiveness, and that might include better quality woodland, some wetland habitats, moorland, then they're likely to have a higher biodiversity unit value. And it's also worth being aware that there's a national scheme to provide statutory biodiversity credits. So this is credits the government will provide, but these are priced at probably about 3 times what they expect normal biodiversity units to go for. So the whole intention is to discourage their use. Next slide. So looking at some worked examples to try and get our head around how this might apply practicably. If you had a 2-hectare field, been fairly intensively managed, improved, lowlium, clover, grassland, and you were interested in enhancing it by overseeding it, careful, reduced, less intensive management, with the aim of converting it to a diverse flower-rich grassland. Feeding stuff into the metric, it might have a start value of 8 biodiversity units, and then the enhanced value might be 14.96 biodiversity units, which could give you a net increase of 6.96 units. And then applying sort of things where the market might be at the moment, that could have a value of 139,000, equivalent to 69,000 per hectare. Next. But you might think, oh, that's lots of money, though that has to cover all of the costs for that 30-year period. So that has to cover the cost of habitat creation, the management costs for 30 years, and do you know what diesel prices will be in 2050? There's a lot of uncertainty as you go further forward in time. It needs ecological monitoring, perhaps every 4 or 5 years by a consultant for that 30-year period. You need to think about the effects it will have on the land value, because you've lost any flexibility for how that land will be valued. You need to put in place legal agreements, so you need to work with the lawyers to do that. You may well have costs for marketing or work with a broker who will have his percentages that he'll look at. And then you will be accepting liabilities, because if you don't achieve those biodiversity units, you'll have to provide them somewhere else. And then there's also uncertainty over how this will fit in with the tax system, and there could well be costs to deliver it in a tax effective manner. Next. Looking at another option, you've got an area of commercial conifer Sitka, say, and you're looking at changing that to perhaps by selective thinning and then planting broadleaves to change it to a mixed woodland. If we look at how that those changes, again for a 2-hectare plantation, the baseline would be 4 biodiversity units. Its enhanced value, and you probably only will achieve poor condition, is 8 biodiversity units, gives you an increase of 4 biodiversity units. And I think that woodland units will have a slightly higher value per unit, so you might then get a unit's worth £120,000, or perhaps a gain around about £60,000 per hectare. Costs that you need to think about, in addition to all the other things which we talked about earlier, were thinning. So depending on the crop, that might incur net costs, or you could have some income from the value of those thinnings. You can't use any planting grants because that would be double counting. So you'll have the establishment costs, management costs during establishment, but perhaps after 5 years, your management costs might be fairly low. Next. So thinking about the pros and cons, market is fairly immature. We don't know what the prices will be, likely to change. The supply and demand is uncertain. It's uncertain particularly for perhaps areas which are more remote from concentrations of development. The delivery system is immature and it's still very much under development. If you commit to biodiversity net gain, you remove flexibility of that land management for a generation. So it's a significant change. The tax regime for it is unclear at present, and we need more clarification on that to know actually what proportion of that potential income might then disappear in tax. It can be compatible with some of the elements of a more regenerative approach to agriculture, where you might be looking for much more diverse swards, putting in ponds as habitat benefit and watering. So it's something that you might consider for spare land within a farm. You'd be very unlikely to consider it for productive land. But it's worth thinking about that there's no commitment until a legal agreement is entered into. So you could do that habitat creation without any grant assistance and still not be committed, and then see if that's something that you want to go into. And similarly, you can survey and assess the baseline conditions without any commitment at that stage. So if you're thinking about it, your initial costs might be fairly limited, and it's something that then might be worth considering. Next. So something to consider perhaps before considering other grants, because if you go for SFI grants and such like, then you won't be able to go for BNG on the elements for which there's already government funding. If you're looking at very small areas of land, then they're less likely to be viable. And for urban fringe areas, either you've got a lot of opportunities or your land value may well increase because of the interest from BNG in those sorts of locations. I think that's probably it. Is that the last slide? Yeah, so that just gives me my contact details. Very complicated project. There's a lot of devil in the detail, but hopefully that gives sort of a bit of a simplistic overview of it all. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tony. Right, I think we've all got our cameras back on, and I will go on to the chat to start looking at some of the questions. So we had some questions earlier on that I think I wanted to put kind of to everybody. Where shall I? Oh, there's been a few questions coming through while I've been set up the different way. So I will get back up to the top and start working through some of these. What was the first one I didn't answer before? So this was the first one was from Bill during the woodland stuff, but I think it's relevant to BNG as well. Well, it's kind of almost the opposite way with BNG. Should we assume that the highest value in terms of natural capital will always be the least changed from its natural state? Who wants to come in there? Yeah.
Yes, I would say yes. Basically, the condition assessments are aligned with general assessments for good ecological quality, and a lot of those will be based on sort of pristine habitats. So yeah, that's a good overview.
Yeah. Ed or Johanna, have you got anything to add to that one?
Not really, not without a kind of, I suppose that there might be scenarios where through habitat creation you could change the value. It depends whether it's BNG specific or more broadly natural capital. I think there's probably a difference there, but yeah, broadly, yeah, no, I agree with Tony.
Yeah, I think the phrasing of that question, the highest value in terms of natural capital, yes. If you're looking at something else, like if you're looking at something to improve your economic resilience, it might be something else. But in terms of natural capital, I guess there's also the added issue of, knowing what the natural state was before. But But yeah, interesting question.
Thank you. Next one, who decides if a company's continuing emissions against which the carbon offsets are targeted are genuinely unavoidable? So I think that's relating to, and by all means, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong. So is there anything looking at whether a company is offsetting what they need to offset, or kind of only the stuff that they can't deal with themselves? I suppose it's whether there's going to be any regulation there to say, well, that stuff you could do within the company, and then this is stuff that you could only do with offsetting elsewhere, or whether they can offset as much as they like and still pollute, I suppose is the...
So I suppose there's a couple of points that I can make here. One is that the Woodland Carbon Code is a methodology. It's one of a number of voluntary carbon methodologies, and some of those, rightly have had high levels of scrutiny. The sort of ones that are, avoided deforestation in South America, that kind of thing, that have basically found to be not worthwhile, not doing what they're supposed to. So there are a whole range of schemes out there, and there is very little on a kind of whole market level to stop a business making a claim. And whether or not that's accurate in terms of the Woodland Carbon Code, and certainly how we work with the Woodland Trust, is there are effectively, I suppose, accreditation process schemes for businesses. So the typical one is Science-Based Targets Initiative, which businesses can follow, where they have publicly stated and scrutinized net zero plans, and that ultimately is what you'd look for businesses to show that genuinely they are reducing their emissions as far as possible, which should be the first step, and then looking to offset only for a very, relatively small layer of emissions that are unavoidable. Great,
thanks, Ed. Tony, have you got anything to add to that in terms of BNG? Okay. Johanna, anything to add to that one? Oh, good stuff. Thanks, everybody. Is there a scheme for existing woodland where carbon credits can be generated?
Yes, potentially. It's not the Woodland Carbon Code. As far as I'm aware, there was an example of, I think, a pilot scheme that was looking at restoring fragmented remnants of ancient woodland, but that was very fragmented and not woodland cover, and because it was ancient woodland, it hadn't been for a long time. There are, as I mentioned, a range of other methodologies out there for voluntary carbon units, and I believe that some of them do extend to woodland condition, because a woodland that is managed and in good ecological condition should sequester, should provide gains. To be entirely honest, it's not something that I'm directly involved with. If you get my contact details, which they're circulated at the end, I can try and put you in touch, because I think I have come across a couple of developers that with schemes, but certainly not the sort of not under the Woodland Carbon Code.
Great, thanks, Ed. I think Johanna, you did share a link for that question when it was asked, didn't you? I think.
Yes, but it's just a link to grants for existing woodland. It's not related to carbon credits. It's
not the carbon credits. Okay, thank you. This one is, I suppose, a bit more general, but around the options. But there's a concern about taking productive food growing land out of action to convert to woodland. And obviously there's now SFI, countryside stewardship options for agroforestry. Are there natural capital carbon credits for agroforestry and silver pasture as well, or anywhere else?
They are under development as a add-on to the Woodland Carbon Code. We were involved with some of the pilots that were funded by the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. It's not yet been rolled out, and there are challenges, because if I mentioned carbon sequestration rates kind of pick up from 1,100 stems per hectare, silver pastoral schemes, are not likely to be anywhere near that. And certainly if you're looking at silver arable sort of alley cropping schemes, that sort of thing, the sequestration for the, you know, attached to such a small number of trees is generally not that significant. What you might be more likely to, I mean, it may come in time, but it's likely to be a very small opportunity compared to woodland carbon, but it might be something that a farmer can do, you know, for their own emissions if they're looking or worried about offsetting their own and not so much worried about generating finance through significant sales. Beyond that, you'd really be looking at soil carbon. Again, not something I'm directly involved with, but I know that there are voluntary carbon schemes around soil management, and it would be sort of akin to that, which is a small number of units more regularly, I think.
Great, thank you. Johanna, have you got anything to add on that one? No. Yeah, I think particularly with those ones, obviously the support putting the trees in and stuff, and we're building up quite a good kind of case studies and things about the other benefits to the farming and stuff. So you might not be able to get carbon credits, but there does seem to be a lot of or there is a lot of other benefits in terms of using agroforestry and stuff. So it's still worth thinking about, even if the carbon credit bit doesn't come off. Next question that we had answered. That was a peatland one, which I'll put to Garrett separately. That's a peatland one. Right, a BNG one. Can you combine nutrient neutrality with BNG?
Yes.
Crazy.
Short and sweet answer.
Thanks, Tony. If you want more detail on that, Piers, please, or have you got some more?
There's a link lower down in the chat to a government site, which is very, very useful. It answers a lot of BNG questions there, but it does tell you where you can combine stuff and where you can't.
Great, thank you. One from Bill: is the BNG value spread over the whole 30 years, i.e. divide by 30 to get an annual equivalent relative to SFI?
Simple answer is no. More complicated answer would be it depends how you're delivering it and the agreements that you have in place with the person who's buying those units. So there are systems whereby effectively a habitat banking organisation can act as a go-between, and you may then be in a situation where they pay you upfront and annual payments. If we were advising a large landowner who is wanting to do this on, perhaps 20 hectares of their land, then we would be suggesting that they sought to get all of the money upfront. And a lot of developers are effectively just wanting the problem to go away in planning terms. So if they can spend the money, get everything sorted out, then they're often happy with that approach. But again, it's the sort of thing where at the moment people are very much putting those systems in place. And it's one of the things which you have to be cautious on, but it isn't set up to be an annual payment.
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't know quite kind of at the context of the question, but yeah, so you'll get the money in one lump sum most likely, but yeah, in terms of an annual value, you would have to divide it by 30, but there's lots of other things going on there in terms of price for cost of delivery and stuff that you'd have to consider there, Bill. Next question: is there a linkage between BNG and CCB, climate community biodiversity standards?
Not in formal terms, no. So BNG effectively stands alone. I think there's probably a lot of commonality between them, but BNG is entirely about habitats. I suppose the planning decisions will consider community benefits and such like, but no, it's just a standalone system.
Great, thank you. And this is where we've come to the point where Ed's put that link in for the government stuff about what links up together. Next question: what about the carbon sink capacity of grassland soils in wood pasture system? I suppose that's a general question. You've mentioned it a little bit, Ed.
Yeah, I can't answer that. I suspect it depends on the type of soil. Yeah, I'm sorry. My sort of remit is woodland carbon, unfortunately.
Anybody else want to chip in on that?
My instinct is to say there's probably a very big sea sink capacity there, but I guess it's depending on various factors like how old the woodland is and also what soil type is, like Ed mentioned. Maybe it's interesting for some of you to know, building up upon the NEIRF funded project that developed a prototype agroforestry carbon calculator. We're running a project up in Scotland under a similar funding vehicle, and it's been running since April, and hoping to publish results next April, where we're looking at different carbon potentials of agroforestry projects and also hedgerows. So we're using various calculators to see what kind of benefits also beyond carbon can come out of projects that are doing lots of little things, not maybe focused on woodland, but a little bit of woodland and a little bit of agroforestry. So I'm sure that might be an interesting thing to look out for once we've got some results to publish there.
Yeah, definitely. Let's watch this space sort of thing. And I think as you said, Bill, soils do seem to lose out a little bit. And I think there's so much variety and they're still finding it pretty hard to monitor. And obviously some of the carbon calculators have started putting sequestration stuff in, but it's really, really vague. And actually the testing, there's lots of different soil tests, but as you well know, Bill, there's it's limited and it's different everywhere you go, kind of what we're seeing from them. So I think it's going to be a wait and see. But as you say, the SFI payment for species rich grassland, which if you can get it, is £646 per hectare for a 5-year agreement. That'll be. So yeah, it may well be worth just going in on that if you can get it and not worrying about carbon until the market is set. Because I think there's something that's gone a theme throughout the presentations today is that this is early stages for a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of kinks being worked out. So where obviously the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code has got some solid validation and stuff behind it. Not everything is in place in terms of B&G and stuff. One question that came up for me as we were going, and we have slightly run over, but we'll do this last one and then I'll do my last couple of slides and then we can finish, was about kind of penalties if you don't deliver what the estimate assumed you would deliver. So if you've oversold in any of these schemes, what are the consequences? We have a quick run through that and then we'll wrap up.
I'm happy to go first. It's there's no one answer with carbon because it depends on the scenario. If there are losses of woodland carbon units, you can rely on a central buffer, which all projects contribute to. It depends also if you've sold those units, the terms of those of that contract. But generally, you will be expected to replant and replace lost units if they're not covered by the buffer. It's why it goes back to that final tip that I included that is, it's making sure the calculation is really realistic for what will be delivered on the site and reflects that.
Great, thanks, Ed.
I think in biodiversity gain terms, it's worth bearing in mind that the legislation only came in at the beginning of this year, so we're not at the stage where things have gone on the ground and been tested and such like. But it links into the comment about, is it an annual payment or do you get it up front? Effectively, you're getting it up front and therefore you get all of the liability. So if you sold those units, you have a responsibility to deliver them, and it remains with you. There will be assessments being done by probably the local authorities. The monitoring, which I mentioned, at 4 to 5 year intervals, will pick up any shortfalls. It's accepted that a lot of habitats will take a while to get to the target condition, but if you go beyond the time it's expected to take, then things would start to kick in and people would be wanting you to do something to put it right. And it's, again, in a similar way as Ida mentioned, what we would be very much advising is that you don't set too high targets. So as an example, if you set your target as lowland meadow, you probably won't achieve it, and therefore your risk is enormous. If you set your target as a poorer quality grassland community, you've got a better chance, a good chance of achieving it. So it's being sensible and on all of these, getting advice and getting up-to-date advice, because things are changing really quite quickly.
Great, thanks, Tony. I will just share my last couple of slides. I promise it's not very much at all. Just for, I'll skip through to end. We are still delivering as the Soil Association the Future Farm Resilience Fund. So if you haven't already, you can get one-to-one sessions, not on particularly this stuff today from us, but see, these guys are all available for you to seek out and chat to, and again, I'll share contact details afterwards. But in terms of the general, the schemes, the kind of how that practically fits with your farm, we can do one-to-one advisor sessions with the team on that, which can include a farm visit and stuff if necessary. And we tend to start with a phone call and see where we're at, but we're happy to help on those things. So do get in touch if that's something that you want to take up. That this program finishes in March, so crack on. Obviously, hopefully we'll have more detail in November. So in terms of other webinars as well, obviously the Green Finance, the Nature Markets one is what we're doing today. Next week we have a livestock special, and we're being joined by Phil Stocker from the National Sheep Association. So we're really focusing on the payments around livestock farms for that one. There's also resources on the website. So some of our previous updates, when stuff has come out from DEFRA, myself and Jerry try and kind of go through that and kind of translate it from government speak to something useful wherever we can. The farming land use team are always here to help, basically. So we've got a mix of specialisms and experts in various different fields. So do get in touch and we'll make sure that you're speaking to the right member of the team, but there is quite a variety of us now. Second last slide is, obviously this is quite a tricky time in farming. I don't know if farming is always a tricky time, it maybe is, but it feels very uncertain at the moment. So if any of these things, speak to people. There's lots of charities out there just waiting to hear from you and to help, or even the advisors and stuff, where we're all kind of, we're all here to help, and sometimes just talking about it helps. So do feel free to do that. So thank you from me. I will stop sharing again. Thank you so much to Ed and Tony and Johanna for presenting. Thank you to Garance for sending us her recorded one. And please do keep sending questions through, and I will pick those up and send a follow-up email afterwards. So that's it. Thank you all.